Welcome to the Quotient Rule, with me, Aline Bilsell. So the quotient rule, according to the internet, the source of all information in this world, is a way of differentiating the quotient of a function. So the commonly used formula for the quotient rule is if f is the numerator and g is the denominator, g f prime minus f g prime over g squared. But the cool trick Mr. Farrar taught us in class was this little song, low d high minus high d low, squared to the denominator, and away we go. A good way to remember it on a test. So we all know that practice makes perfect, so let's start off with a relatively easy problem to get us warmed up for what's coming next. So if we were asked to find the derivative of this function, 6x squared over 2 minus x, we could use the formula that I gave you guys in the previous section of this video, f prime times g minus f g prime over g squared. You can plug those values into this equation and get that. So we finished the calculus portion of this problem, but oftentimes the algebra is the most difficult part of this problem. So we would multiply and subtract everything together in the numerator and end up with this equation. Still, we're not done though. We can take out a 6x, and by simplifying further, and we're left with this. Now we can simplify what is in the parentheses, and there we go. We're left with our final answer, 6x times 4 minus x over 2 minus x squared. So if we move on to a bit more of a difficult problem, we can see that this problem doesn't only incorporate the quotient rule, but also the chain rule. Now, the problems that you will probably encounter on your test will not just include the quotient rule, but will include other rules of derivatives that you have learned throughout the class. So make sure to review those if you're confused. So we're asked to find the derivative of cosine squared 2x over tangent 3x, and just by looking at it we see that this does incorporate the chain rule, so we have to be sure to use that while we are setting up the formula for the quotient rule that I gave you earlier in the video. And we should end up with something like this. We have to, of course, make sure to use the chain rule. And this function does look very unsimplified, so we have to make sure that we can simplify it further. And it seems just by looking at it that we can probably combine some like terms in the numerator. So we multiply the 2's together and the -1, and we end up with something like this. Now, it's quite rare that we'll be left with something so unsimplified, but just make sure to double check. Since the last practice problem we did was not very simplification heavy, let's do one that requires a bit more simplification. So we can actually simplify this function before we even find the derivative. Now we can find the derivative. We take our original function and plug it into the quotient rule function that we have, low d high minus high d low. And of course, don't forget to square the denominator. And now the simplification can begin. We make sure to multiply all the values in the numerator so that we can later combine all the like terms to get our answer. Now that we've multiplied all the values that we can in the numerator, we can look for our like terms, and add or subtract them. This should simplify our function greatly, so that we end up with 1/2 x 2 minus x to the 1/2 over x to the power of 3/2. So now we can further simplify by crossing out the x's and bring the 1/2 down to the denominator, leaving us with 2 minus square root of x over 2x squared. So let's move on to some common mistakes made while completing these problems. The first common mistake we'll talk about is not subtracting the values in the numerator while setting up your equation. So students will often make this mistake when they're running out of time or just nervous during a test. So just make sure you're very familiar with the formula of the quotient rule. Another very common mistake made by a lot of students is not squaring the denominator. I actually made this mistake many times while making this video. It's, again, really important to be very familiar with the equation of the quotient rule, because this is one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people do. The final common mistake is not simplifying your answer fully. So this is a very common mistake made by a lot of people, and good simplification means combining like terms, not leaving any negative exponents in the numerator or the denominator, not leaving any fractions in the numerator or the denominator. So please remember to simplify and double check as well.